Thank you, Rita, for the introduction. My name is Erica Kuligowski, and I am honored to have this opportunity to give a plenary talk on the topic of bushfire evacuation. Thank you to the IAFSS, with special thanks to the Executive Committee for this opportunity. Thank you also to those who are listening today. I wish we could all be there in the same room in person. Before I begin, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country from the location from which I'm presenting today, Melbourne, Australia. RMIT acknowledges the people of the Wuwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded land we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. So before I get started, just a brief outline of the talk today. I'll give an introduction, I'll give some background on evacuation modeling concepts, and most of the presentation I'll focus on past research, so what has been done in the field so far. I'll then get into current challenges and end with a discussion on future research. And in addition to the many research references I have in my Fire Safety Journal article, this presentation highlights many new references that have been published since I wrote it. So I have a few slides at the end of this talk that list the new references. I'm happy to share that list with anyone who is interested. So let's get started. The IAFSS Agenda 2030 for a Fire-Safe World recognizes bushfires as an important area for research and action. So as you well know, places around the world are experiencing extreme fire conditions, rapid fire spread, abrupt changes in fire spread direction, multiple ignitions over time, and even mega fire behavior like fire jumps, whirls, tornadoes, and localized weather systems. So these conditions are linked to climate change, expanding into the wildland-urban interface, and fire exclusion, or the buildup of fuels due to suppression and lack of safe burning. So from the multiple inquiries performed on fires from last year's bushfire season in Australia, and I quote, "It is clear that we should expect fire seasons like 2019, 2020, or potentially worse to happen again." So it's estimated that about 3% of these fires spread to communities, potentially causing deaths and injuries. So because of this, a common goal of response agencies has been to evacuate households before the fire reaches the community. So evacuations are already complicated enough, especially in conditions where the fires are closely approaching or have even entered the evacuating community. But evacuations can be further complicated by existing physical and social infrastructure. So for example, physical infrastructure could be limited or blocked egress routes, insufficient capacity of routes or transit options, power losses hindering communication, and limited mobile phone coverage. As far as social infrastructure, there could be community vulnerabilities that outweigh the capabilities or capacities of the community. For example, maybe people who are older in age, people who have more responsibility for family, house, or work, people maybe who have less experience or knowledge about fires, or have less personal or financial resources to be able to respond to the fire. This also includes populations with lower levels of risk perception or ability to potentially physically evacuate. This could also be complicated by a reliance on services or plans that are limited in some way. So at the household level, for example, this could be a reliance on unreliable or informal communication or transportation systems that may not be available when an actual event occurs. At the community level, this could be perhaps a reliance on reaching everyone in the community via opt-in emergency communication systems, where we know that only a proportion of the population sign up for these systems. It could also be a reliance on evacuation plans that are incomplete or may not account for the possible fire or evacuation scenarios. Or it could be emergency communication strategies that may not meet the needs of the entire population. So as a result, deaths and other negative consequences, for example, injuries or even long-lasting personal trauma, can and have resulted from fires linked to households evacuating late or not at all in areas threatened by fires, last-minute evacuations of critical facilities, people experiencing heavy congestion or being trapped in vehicles or involved in accidents even, as well as people having to take temporary refuge in areas of last resort or even reporting shelters that are unable to accommodate their needs. And this is not to mention the impact that fires have on buildings and infrastructure systems themselves. So what can we do as researchers or practitioners or others to help reduce these negative consequences to the community? There are many ways to mitigate, and many of the researchers listening today are already working in these areas. For example, mitigation and fuels reduction, or advanced detection, and I'm showing both of those on the screen. Improved modeling capabilities and prediction, increased firefighting capabilities and technologies, as well as building codes and standards. We could look to the population, so household education programs, for example, training exercises, vulnerable populations database. As far as community infrastructure, maybe increased coverage or reliability of power and communication systems, developing sheltering guidelines, increasing the capacity of routes and primarily for new communities. But what I'd like to talk about today are improving evacuation plans and emergency communication strategies and templates, and particularly the use of evacuation modeling decision tools, such as evacuation models, to further develop and improve evacuation plans, or even help decision makers make better decisions during an actual event. So let's get into some background on evacuation modeling concepts. So while this is not necessarily standard practice, simulation models are increasingly used to inform the development of evacuation plans for communities prone to bushfires. So Ronke and colleagues in their e-Sanctuary report, based on Tom Kova's work, developed an A-set, R-set concept similar to buildings, but for bushfires. So evacuation models can help us understand how long a community will take to evacuate for a specific event or evacuation scenario, or a set of these events or scenarios. And then these evacuation or clearance times can then be compared with fire spread times for various fire scenarios. And the idea is that with this information, we can identify a boundary or a series of boundaries for different fire types around a community, also called trigger buffers, whereby once a fire or a specific fire type crosses that boundary, the community should be warned. And that is to allow for enough people to safely leave. Sorry, really the entire community to safely leave. So there are benefits to these evacuation models. They allow officials to make pre-event decisions on evacuation start times, as we just discussed, kind of planning for those. The best evacuation routes, the most appropriate traffic management measures for different fires or evacuation scenarios. There's just a few of the benefits of models. And there are three main types of methods to model household evacuation: macroscopic, microscopic, and mesoscopic. So macro models represent households and traffic behaviors at the aggregate level to identify broader trends in evacuation behavior. So this requires data on speeds and flows, capacities, densities, that kind of thing. Micromodels, on the other hand, allow for the simulation of individual agents and or vehicles. So this requires additional data, specifically data on individual or household decisions and behaviors, as well as movements within the larger evacuating community. Mesoscopic models provide a compromise between those two methods, describing traffic entities at a higher level of detail and their interactions at a lower resolution. So while very few simulation models exist just for bushfire evacuation models, Some are currently in development, and others offer specific aspects. For example, the traffic simulation aspect, right? Maybe modeling the traffic using models for non-emergency scenarios that can then be compared with other models such as fire models. And as with any models that are in their infancy, there are issues with current models, limitations. So many of them make assumptions about behaviors or allow users the opportunity to make assumptions about behaviors that are not necessarily grounded in reality or what people would actually do in a fire event. So for example, these assumptions that people will behave optimally during the evacuation. So for example, there may be the assumption or the ability to say that there's no delay at all, or that there's a very short delay before people enter the traffic network. A popular one is the assumption or the default that people will travel their shortest or fastest route out of the community. Another assumption is that households have sufficient vehicle capacity. They don't have to rely on other people or other forms of transit for evacuation. So while these assumptions may be appropriate when using the model to estimate, for example, the best case scenario, or using models to plan out a phased evacuation approach, these may not be appropriate and are often not appropriate when using models to estimate the evacuation time of a community. And so that's important, right? Because we're trying to use these models to understand under various scenarios when the community needs to be warned or ordered to start their evacuation. Other limitations, maybe only one mode is simulated, perhaps only like public transport is simulated by a model, or the defaults or judgments made by the user are not grounded in theory or data. For example, allowing movement of cars through smoke or heavy fire conditions, not allowing for rerouting or decision making during evacuation, or even trips that are made prior to moving to safety, often called intermediate trips, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So research has shown that models can be overly optimistic. Simulating realistic behaviors can significantly decrease evacuation effectiveness when compared with simulations incorporating optimal assumptions. And this makes sense because when you start incorporating actual behavior, there are delays associated with these decisions and actions that people make during an event. And so why do models make these assumptions, or require the users to make these assumptions, or have these types of model defaults? It's because little data exists, or one of the main reasons is because little data exists on human behavior in fire. And that's especially the case after a household makes a decision to evacuate. There are several decisions that are made after that. Once the household has entered the traffic network, where we have very little data on. So I haven't spoken yet about the process that people go through during an evacuation. So to simulate household evacuation timeline, traffic or evacuation models traditionally follow 4 steps. The first being trip generation, which predicts the number of people who will evacuate and when they will depart. The next is trip distribution, which predicts where, so the destination, people travel to reach safety. Next is modal split, which predicts the types of transportation chosen for evacuation. And lastly, traffic assignment, which predicts the routes chosen to reach the destination. Included within that are driving parameters, so speeds and flows, for example. So let's think about the first part, trip generation, as the decision, and the rest of those steps as movement. So let's look at what research has been done on bushfire evacuation thus far. The first part of trip generation is the evacuation decision. And based on the protective action decision model by Lindell and Perry, individuals engage in a decision-making process before deciding to evacuate. So let's take a look. We have this person here, and they're potentially exposed to cues from their environment, both social and physical, as well as they're bringing in individual experience and knowledge potentially about the fire itself. And in order to shift that person's in order to shift that person's perceptions from safety to risk, in order for them to decide to evacuate, they have to follow a decision-making process. So they have to receive the cues around them, they have to pay attention to them, they have to understand the cues, they have to believe or think that there is a credible threat. They have to personalize the risk to themselves, and then they have to make a decision on a behavior, particularly one that they have the capability of enacting. And throughout this, they're also confirming with other people the milling process, confirming that there's actually a threat and that they have to do something about it. So information-seeking behaviors occur during this decision-making process and protective actions after the decision is made. And so after one has made a decision to evacuate, they may or may not go through a series of protective actions. So gathering their belongings, helping others, maybe warning others, or they could directly go take their behavioral response and evacuate. So previous studies have been conducted to identify the factors that influence various stages in this decision-making process. There's the chart there to show a summary of the factors, both from bushfire research as well as hurricane research. And so these are the factors that have been found from previous research to influence various stages of that decision-making process. But I should point out that most of the studies have been done to predict the evacuation decision itself, right? So most of the arrows are moving toward that protective action decision-making box because that's what they mostly studied. And so we've identified pre-event factors that have been influential in the decision to evacuate, such as demographics, place and location factors, responsibilities people may have for children or livestock or pets, the knowledge and experience that they bring into the event, their previous experience with hazards, for example, and then event factors like cues, environmental cues, social cues, warnings, and their perceived threat, perceived risk, as well as self-efficacy. And I'd like to draw your attention to a few new references listed on the slide, particularly the one that I worked on studying the 2016 Chimney Tops 2 fire in Tennessee in the United States. And we identified some novel findings on the relationship between two factors, so fire cues, in particular smoke, as well as warnings from a trusted source with risk perceptions. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. And so the second part of trip generation is timing. However, there hasn't been much study done on departure timing for bushfire. So in my fire safety journal paper, I discuss Wu et al. And they developed a cumulative curve of vehicles leaving Fort McMurray based on traffic counts on major highways. And they noted the resulting response curve with the same S-shape, similar to hurricane departure times, however, with a shorter tail and a steeper slope for bushfires, which makes sense thinking about the differences in lead time between those two disaster types. And although this paper is getting into departure time, it focuses more on departure time from the Fort McMurray region rather than the time that vehicles entered the network, like left their home or business. But since I published the Fire Safety Journal article, two new studies have been published. One from Grudgera et al. That looks at awareness and departure times in the 2018 Camp Fire in California. And so they identified factors that influenced a later or an earlier awareness time as well as departure times. And these are actual times measured from 6 a.m. One of the days of the fire. And then factors that influenced a shorter or longer prep time, also could be called delay time, right? The difference between awareness and departure for each respondent. And so although their prep or delay model had low explanatory power, they did identify some potential insights that I'd like to highlight. So, for example, being male, having home insurance, or living in the community for at least 15 years were all associated with longer preparation times. And so that's interesting, and I think this paper really helps us to be thinking about what we should be studying as far as departure timing in the future for fires, for the bushfire field. Another study from Light et al. 2021 was performed on the types of behaviors that are performed during this kind of delay time period and the potential factors of influence on both type and timing. And so she highlighted the types of behaviors performed, and they fall within 4 main categories. So seeking information, gathering belongings, protecting property, and protecting life and health. She also looked at the mean number of actions and their influential factors as well. So both really interesting papers recently published that can really help drive some new research in this area in bushfire. So household level data on evacuation decision making they have been used to develop event-specific discrete choice models to predict the likelihood of each household evacuating in a specific event. And so these models can estimate how many households in a given area will evacuate. And although there's very little data on departure time, some of these models consider the decision to evacuate and the decision on when to depart as a joint decision. So they're using sequential binary logit models to predict the probability of a household evacuating at certain times or intervals as a function of social and environmental factors. And so in this case, the decision to evacuate is considered as a series of binary choices estimated at each time step or each event. So taking this one step further, the model I'm showing on the screen was developed by a team led by Ruggiero Lavreglio. And this model uses hybrid choice modeling, which incorporates psychological factors as latent variables. In this case, it's risk perception. So this is a sequential model with the first model estimating an individual's risk perception level based on certain environmental, individual, and social factors. And then the second model, based upon the risk perception value for any given person, a utility model estimates the probability that the individual will engage in a particular behavioral state. So normal, investigation state, vigilant state, or protective state. So overall, these data and models ultimately provide overall numbers, participation rates, and evacuation response curves for macro models, or individual household decisions, sometimes over time, for micro models. So that was trip generation. Now we're into the next step, trip distribution. And so a few fire studies have identified preferences related to destinations. So the first preference would be for that they found that people prefer to take shelter at relatives or families' homes. And then the second preference, hotel and motels. The third, other locations like campground or vacation homes. And then finally, public shelters. Hurricane studies also document a similar trend. In addition, they identify other types of destinations like churches and workplaces. And discrete choice modeling has been used to predict the likelihood of households choosing one destination type or zone over others based on a variety of social and environmental factors from the event. And so these findings can then be used to provide either percentages of usage of destination types for macro models or more specific individual household choices for micro models. And more recently, Wong used portfolio choice modeling to identify any joint preferences that existed between choices by interacting dimensions. So what's relevant in this case, the factors that influenced both the destination or shelter type and evacuation location, so within or outside of the county. So now we're on to modal split. So a few bushfire studies have looked into preferences for different types of vehicles and found, the few studies that have worked on this have found a preference for personal vehicles. I've only found hurricane studies that looked into factors that influenced a preference or the use of non-household or non-vehicle choices. And those factors were socioeconomic status, household characteristics, and previous experience. Some studies have identified trends in the number of vehicles used for evacuation per household. There are a few fire studies found and hurricanes show that multiple vehicles per household can be used, as well as um, these these vehicles may be smaller cars, or they also could be trailers for livestock, recreational vehicles, larger trucks. And this is important because these larger vehicles take up more space, more capacity on the roadway. And so if we're not including that in our evacuation planning, we or in our modeling, we may be actually underestimating the time a community takes to evacuate. Also, studies found people engage in intermediate trips. So these are trips taken by evacuees during the evacuation process, but not to their final destination. There were studies that found kind of the number of average intermediate trips per person, as well, sorry, the average number of intermediate trips per person or household, as well as some studies have looked into the purpose of these intermediate trips. For example, over 50% of the trips in one study were performed to pick up or meet household members, especially children, at locations within the fire-affected area. So again, these are things that take additional time that may not be accounted for in current evacuation models or evacuation scenarios. So finally, traffic assignment. Disaster studies have been performed on the types of routes people prefer to use during evacuations, maybe highways or back roads. A few Bush studies were found that looked at highway and non-highway route preferences, as well as a study found a smaller percentage in this particular fire that used the shorter or faster routes. So remember, this was the kind of the default in most of the evacuation models, that people use the shortest and fastest route. But hurricane research overwhelmingly finds a preference for people to use, overwhelmingly finds that people prefer to use their familiar routes over shortest or quickest. And this can be influenced by factors like previous experience, information provided during their actual movement and travel, accessibility of the route, the type of road, as well as the services available along that route. And last, taking this a bit further, studies of movement in fog have found that route familiarity influenced speed choice in non-emergency conditions. So from that, and kind of moving a bit further into bushfire, more recently work has been performed at Lund University to better understand the factors that influenced driving behaviors. And so they studied how smoke obscuration may affect speed or lane position using VR. So let's briefly discuss what's missing, or how might we fill in the gaps. So first, I would say that we have an incomplete understanding of evacuation decision making in bushfires. So most of our studies, including my own, focuses on predicting the protective action that is either evacuate or stay, without delving into the nuances, right? So stay could mean that people actually defend their home, or it means they shelter in place. And there's also the action of wait and see. And so I've highlighted a few studies on the screen there that delve into these nuances in protective action. Also, most studies focus on the factors that influence the evacuation decision itself, rather than looking at the factors that influence risk perception, or whether people feel or perceive a credible threat, or even some of the pre-decisional stages of the decision-making process. So certainly more work needs to go into that. There's also kind of the relationship between factors and the stage or the decision can be complicated. So I didn't get into this when I showed that summary of the graphic of all the factors that influenced the evacuation decision, for example. But some of those relationships are complicated in that some studies have found a relationship, some studies may have found a positive relationship, and others may have found a negative, and some may have not found a relationship at all. With previous experience, for example, with fire cues, it could be that they're measuring these variables in different ways. Previous experience, for example, some studies measure it, have you ever evacuated before? Some measure it by asking, have you ever been in a fire before? And also whether or not the evacuation or the actual fire event was a positive or negative experience could influence the decisions in the next event. And a lot of that nuance is potentially not captured in the survey work that we do. And sometimes these factors are just studied infrequently, right? And so we may be looking, again, a lot at the evacuation decision and studying the factors that affect that, but potentially missing factors that affect other decisions along the way. There's also very little data on departure time, the delay time, the time between awareness and departure, which includes both the decision time, the time before, up until the decision is made, and the mobilization time, right, the time to perform protective actions. And most data is obtained from similar populations. Most work is done in the United States and Australia related to evacuation decision making. And so we need to study fires that occur in other parts of the world. And we also need to obtain perspectives from other populations. I have a few studies that provide exceptions to this, right, that reach out and broaden our understanding and provide different perspectives on evacuation. So Tara McGee, for example, who's giving another plenary talk in the IAFSS, has looked at studies of indigenous Maori residents in New Zealand and also looked at perspectives from the Mishki-Gogamon Ojibwe Nation in Ontario, Canada. Some other perspectives that may be missing, what about tourist populations? So Josh Whitaker, for example, is doing a study at the moment from last year's bushfires in Australia, looking at evacuation of tourist populations. Also people with mobility impairments, older adults, rural or regional residents, non-English speakers. But I want to highlight the importance when we look at other populations, that we focus not only on going right to their vulnerabilities in evacuation, but focusing also on their capabilities, their capacities when when they encounter a fire event and have to perform an evacuation. There's also a lack of data on evacuation movement in bushfires. So we're missing data on the choices made during this time. So for mode, the type, the number, for route, again, the type, en route switching, compliance with traffic management, destination, the type as well. We also don't study intermediate trips as much, right? We're missing data on intermediate trips. I haven't even mentioned background traffic, which has to do with the traffic that is kind of ongoing prior to the initiation of the fire, as well potentially prior to the initiation of an evacuation order. These are people kind of coming in and out of the area, which certainly affect the ability for evacuees to move out of the fire affected areas. And what conditions affect these decisions, right? Environmental conditions, road type, familiarity, previous experience, and what are some of the nuances of these variables? As well as aggregate traffic data is important, and driving parameters for individual vehicles. And then I'd like to just highlight most of the data on evacuation movement, especially, it, it, most of the data that I've pulled for evacuation movement is from hurricanes. And so I'd like to just question the applicability of hurricane data to bushfire. Hurricanes have a longer lead time or time scale for evacuation, different types of warnings, larger areas evacuating at one time, and potentially better predictions of the hurricane, allowing for longer warning times. So it's important for us to think about the applicability of that data to bushfire evacuation. And then there are numerous assumptions made by evacuation simulation models, as I discussed a little bit earlier. There could be the assumption that the population is homogeneous, right, with similar traits and needs, or all or some percentage of the households evacuate after a certain time, maybe a short delay or via an artificial time distribution. There is the assumption that households evacuate together as a unit at the same time. But Alawadi et al., and then some of the work that I'm involved in studying the California fire, the Kincaid fire, challenges this assumption. Right, so some households evacuate at different times, some of them evacuate while others stay behind. So it's important for us to understand that. There's assumptions made that there's sufficient capacity of modes available for evacuation. There's the assumption that households plan ahead and take the shortest and quickest route, that they also stay on that route, and or that they comply with all the traffic instructions. There's assumptions that households distribute themselves evenly among available shelters and that all shelters meet evacuees' needs. And also that households evacuate only when their zone is ordered and they drive directly to the destination. So no need to account for intermediate trips, for example, or background traffic, or even shadow evacuation, which I haven't talked about yet, which is essentially people leaving before their evacuation zone is ordered to do so. And this is not to mention all the assumptions made by the evacuation scenario when running the model, made about the evacuation scenario when running the model. So for example, that all the routes are clear, that smoke or embers do not interfere with the evacuation movement, etc. And again, these are being made primarily because data on bushfire evacuation is scarce. So I'll end my talk today with a discussion on future research areas. So the paper, my fire safety journal paper, lists a number of research topics to fill in these gaps. I won't read them out today. I encourage you to take a look at the paper. And these are questions surrounding the evacuation decision, departure timing, the destination, modes, routes, non-evacuation trips, etc. But just some newer topics that I want to highlight here. What are the effective ways of providing information to people en route, and how might it affect their travel behavior? And on the screen, I reference Zhang et al. That performed a similar study for floods. What is the impact of bushfire maps on decisions made prior to the evacuation decision and then after? While the route is being kind of planned out or even en route. What is the role of the sharing economy? So ride shares and house shares for evacuation. What about evacuation during concurrent hazards like the pandemic or cascading hazards like power loss? And I'd like to bring your attention to Edgley and Burnett that looked at public perceptions of COVID-19 and the 2020 wildfire season in Arizona, as well as Wong, Broder, and Shaheen that developed a checklist of immediate actions for addressing COVID-19 in evacuation planning. Also, a big part of us moving forward and the success of this roadmap depends on collaboration. And so this work requires collaboration across disciplines and organizations. And so evacuation researchers, I challenge you to talk to decision makers, to talk to stakeholders first, and I'm challenging myself as well, to bring them into the research very early, even while you're developing the research idea, right, and writing the proposal, and all the way through to authorship and output and outcomes. Similar to what goes on in Australia, for many years, the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC requires that stakeholders are a part of the projects that they fund. And so multiple disciplines, right, contribute to the field of bushfire evacuation, including engineering, sociology, psychology, geography, anthropology, computer science, I could go on and on. So fire researchers and modelers, I challenge you to reach across the aisle and work with the evacuation folks, right? Reach across to us first and say, hey, I'm working on this piece. What could be the human element of this that I might be missing? Right, so that's the important part. And I feel like, and I'm biased, that I reach out to fire researchers and fire modelers, for example, quite a bit. And it would be great to see the other way around too. Let's also diversify our study populations, right? By country, by population type, looking at certain populations, age, employment, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, culture, residence type, and length. And I challenge you, again, this is a challenge for myself as well, Bring in expertise from the places and populations that you study, and not just to get their ideas and say thank you and move on, but bring in that local expertise right from the beginning while you're proposing the project. Have them work on with you, collect the data, analyze the data, and co-authorship. It's also important for us to study non-household evacuation, like businesses, schools, hospitals, and also diversify our research methods. We have our traditional approaches, and they have their pros and cons, surveys and interviews, and also some traditional approaches with a twist. There's some work in the hurricane realm where, because of the longer lead time, survey questions go out even before the evacuation decision is made, right? As the warnings and such are being relayed, to just ask a few questions to the population before that. We also should be recognizing the benefits of qualitative, participatory, observational techniques where warranted, the work that McGee, Christensen, and Langer have been doing. There's also other data collection methods, pre-event evacuation drills, for example, and then some observational-based approaches at the individual or household level to collect data, such as experimental VR techniques using driving simulators. AR can be used to collect data on evacuation behaviors. And there's big data sources, mobile phone records, GPS trajectories, geotagged tweets from the Twitter stream, traffic camera videos, and the like. And just calling your attention to some interesting work that has been ongoing. And I'm also working with Gile Zhao with a group, some folks from New Zealand, looking at GPS data from the Kincaid fire as well. And also I wanted to highlight some new analysis techniques from AI, machine learning, and Zhao's paper that I have on the screen there compares logit models with machine learning techniques when predicting and analyzing mode choice, for example. So that's really interesting. So thank you for your attention. As I mentioned, I have listed some references on the screen. I'm happy to share those with you. But I just want to conclude by saying that newly improved bushfire evacuation simulation models that reflect real-world evacuation behaviors can be used to advance planning, real-time decision-making, land use and configuration requirements for communities prone to fire, and in turn, better protecting the residents. So this presentation is meant to be a starting point for future discussion and collaboration. I look forward to your comments and your questions, and really maybe taking this forward to develop an official research roadmap for our field. Thank you very much. Happy to share these with anybody. Thank you for your attention today.